Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. So, welcome. My name is Cynthia Jones. I am the program chair of the 9th Judicial Circuit Historical Society. And before we get started, I would like to just briefly give a land acknowledgement that we're on the traditional land of the Coast Salish people, and that includes the Duwamish people, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. And to get to our program today, I would say on behalf of the Historical Society, we also have two co-sponsors. That is the local Federal Bar Association for the Western District of Washington and the FBA of the Northern District of California. We are so thrilled to welcome you all here. We also have on Zoom, this is being simulcast across the 9th Circuit, so welcome to those of you watching virtually. And this program is an excellent example of the kinds of programs we do at the Historical Society. That is our mission to inform about legal history of the West and in the way that it both educates and inspires. The program today is a companion piece to our recent partner program, and that was about the World War II Port Chicago mutiny. And that program was recorded as well and can be found on our website. These two stories today and the World War II history sort of highlight the historical racial injustice and attempts to right those wrongs. And we feel at the Historical Society that those deserve a higher profile than they've had. And we're so pleased that you're here with us today to change that. So without further ado, the man who needs no introduction, our own Western District of Washington Judge, Robert Lasnik.
Thank you so much. The first thing I want to do today is something that gives me a great deal of pleasure as a U.S. District Court judge, as a member of the Seattle King County Bar, and as a human being, and that's introduce you to our newest U.S. District Court Judge, Jamal Whitehead. Jamal, let's stand soon to be Judge Whitehead, as in first week of April, be sworn in, although the big ceremony will be later. Judge Whitehead is taking the position of Judge Richard Jones. No, it's not like we have a black spot and a Hispanic spot or a Jewish spot. But it just turns out that he's taking Judge Jones' position. Judge Jones would have been on this panel, but he has a big brother who's turning 90 this weekend down in Hollywood, Malibu, LA, etc. And when Quincy Jones has a 90th birthday, his kid brother goes down to spend time with him. But we have a really nice video that Judge Jones made about the event and something that he and I did that we both just shake our heads of how lucky we were to walk Fort Lawton / Discovery Park with Jack Hamann and Congressman John Lewis. And Congressman John Lewis, brought out by Congressman Jim McDermott, to find out what happened here back in 1944. And when you see somebody like Congressman John Lewis moved by the experience and you know what he went through, it just humbles you to be in his presence. And Judge Jones is going to talk about that. Judge Beeks, a colleague I never met, but heard some great stories about, was the defense attorney for the black GIs who were charged with rioting and murder. And of course, he wasn't Judge Beeks then. He was Major Beeks, and described by Jack Hamann because of the size of his head more than anything. But we do have a little memorabilia of Judge Beeks up here, starting with his picture, which is hard to see, but we didn't want to knock it over. The Silver Orb of Admiralty was presented to Judge Beeks by the Maritime Bar in 1973, and Judge Beeks' own gavel, which is part of our museum. memorabilia. We don't have any Judge Lasnik memorabilia. But the other story about Judge Beeks is our longtime clerk of court, Bruce Rifkin, told me that he once got a phone call from Judge Beeks to say, I'm leaving my home in Magnolia and driving to the courthouse. And by the time I get there, I want you to have fired my law clerk and get him cleared out. And Bruce has managed to get through some very difficult judges in his time. And he also knew enough to ignore what Judge Beeks said, because by the time he drove from Magnolia over the bridge and into Seattle, he had changed his mind. So, Robbie, don't ever take those calls seriously. I have an amazing panel here today to talk about this event. And the event itself is absolutely amazing. August 1944, almost 80 years ago, something happened at Fort Lawton that resulted in the largest court-martial in terms of number of defendants and in terms of number of days in the entire history of World War II. And I think that the people who you're going to hear from today have a very unique perspective on this. Jack Hamann wrote the book On American Soil, which details what happened then and what happened as he uncovered what happened. He wrote a great story about, actually the piece for King TV, about the events. But at that point, it was just party line. Italian prisoner of war lynched, African-American GIs charged, riot ensued, and that it's pretty much buried in history. But Jack and his wife Leslie Hamann didn't just settle for the party line. They wanted to know there must be more to this than meets the eye. And what Jack and Leslie found after hours and days at the National Archives was a hidden investigative file that revealed the truth of what happened. And that truth is shocking in terms of what really happened or what likely really happened, and the miscarriage of justice that occurred at the hands of the defense because of the prosecution. And this prosecutor wasn't just some faceless, nameless lawyer. It was Leon Jaworski, the great Watergate special counsel who took the Nixon tapes case to the U.S. Supreme Court. And you'll hear from Jack the entire story there. We also have Professor Mary Phan from University of Washington Law School, and she has won all these awards named after law professors who I took when I was there in the 1970s. The Philip A. Troutman Award, the Richard Kumert Award. I'm like, wait a minute. It's like my law clerk, Ali Johnson, says, oh, there's this guy Stobuck who wrote a book about real estate law. I took real property from Professor Stobuck. But anyway, Mary Phan, amazing academic career, great law review articles cited in the Sonia Sotomayor dissent. Also, big part of the ACLU on racial justice. And she will provide a perspective partially from her clerking for a judge on the War Crimes Tribunal. And then at the end, we have Nick Brown, our United States attorney. And Nick comes with so much to contribute to this, including just last week, he went to Selma, Alabama, and did the Edmund Pettus Bridge walk with other U.S. attorneys, with President Biden, and can talk about what it was like to walk in the footsteps of John Lewis and others who suffered so much in 1964. And you start to do the math. Well, 64 is 20 years after 44, and it's 60 years almost ago. And definitely, as Martin Luther King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But we're at a point in our lives and in our society where you have to start to question, what George Santayana clearly said: those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Winston Churchill amended it a little bit to say those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. But we see a point of view in this country that not only doesn't want to learn history or remember history, but wants to distort history and pretend that slavery was not that big a deal. And Jim Crow was actually separate and equal. And the Japanese internment was more like sending people to camp. And we have to fight against that by remembering and walking in the footsteps of events like Edmund Pettus Bridge and Bloody Sunday and Fort Lawton, August of 1944. And we will do that today. So let me turn this over to the great Jack Hamann, and he will introduce the topic, the investigation, and what occurred almost 80 years ago. Jack. Thanks.
There we go. Thank you, Judge Lasnik. I have to say that I've known Judge Lasnik for probably 30, 40 years now, and he still has not learned that there's no great in what I do, but that he certainly is one of those people that I always cite that you've really got to be careful at the beginning of your career who you make friends with and who you insult, because you never know if they're going to climb the ladder. And I knew him when he was a prosecutor at King County, and he helped me at that point, and in the end, thank God I didn't anger him any more than I might have as a reporter back then. I also want to point out, you can stand up again, my wife is Leslie Hammond, who, although my name is on the book, you'll hear more. As you hear more, she'll be here too afterwards if there are questions, and you'll see why that's important. The lynching of an Italian prisoner of war and the trial of 43 men, all of them Black Americans, was an astonishing chapter in American history. But it's not really a chapter because you're not going to find it in most history books, or maybe any history books. In fact, there's a pretty good chance that before you signed up for this, that most of you probably have never heard of this before, that this happened. 2 years ago, a few weeks before the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre that killed nearly 300 people, New York Times columnist Charles Blow warned that, quote, "We sometimes underestimate human impulses and human nature when we simply assume that the memory of a thing, a horrible thing, will last forever. Often the perpetrators of the offense desperately want to let the stigma fade, and the victim hesitates to pass on the pain of it to his children and family. Everyone awaits the healing power of time, like the jagged rock thrown into a river that eventually becomes a smooth stone. And Leslie and I can tell you, those are true words. And let's start a conversation today about this jagged stone. World War II came to an end on August 14th, 1945. Just 9 months earlier, Lieutenant Colonel Leon Jaworski secured convictions in the U.S. Army's longest and largest court-martial of the entire war. And it happened right here in Seattle, just a few miles north of where we're sitting in what is now Discovery Park, but was called Fort Lawton in what was then and still is now the Magnolia neighborhood. Jaworski would go on to prosecute the very first war crimes case in Germany after the war. He later advised the Warren Commission, which investigated the assassination of President Kennedy. In 1971, he served as president of the American Bar Association. But he was most famous as the Watergate special prosecutor, and in 1974, he prevailed in the landmark case U.S. v. Nixon, the Supreme Court decision that ultimately led to President Nixon's decision to resign. Jaworski was undeniably brilliant. In 1925, he became the youngest person ever to be accepted to the Texas bar. He was an accomplished orator, and he could be a bit manipulative. During the trial we're about to talk about, he wrote a letter to the editor that was published in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, complimenting the newspaper's reporters. And even further, he especially complimented its courtroom sketch artists. He wrote, quote, "His ability to sense and sketch with preciseness the exact scene that climaxes a particularly dramatic moment is uncanny." This is a lawyer in an ongoing case calling his case a dramatic moment and being uncanny. That was Leon Jaworski too. Before his death in 1982, Jaworski was a partner in the Houston firm Fulbright and Jaworski, which is one of the largest and most powerful law firms in America. So Leon Jaworski was a pretty big deal. And the Fort Lawton case, as he hoped, proved to be a very big, important, but overlooked jagged rock in that career. As Judge Lasnik mentioned, the defense attorney in that same case was also a big deal, Bill Meeks. He eventually became one of the longest serving federal district judges right here in the Western District of Washington. Before his death in 1988, he was a senior judge and a colleague of several current senior judges who still serve in this district, including Judges Dimmick, Bryan, Zilli, Kunauer, and Rothstein. Bill Meeks grew up wanting to sail the seas, but like Jaworski, he too was brilliant, and his wife let him know that the man she married should apply to law school, not to the Merchant Marine. He eventually, though, as Judge Lasnik pointed out, did become an expert on the law of the sea. But during World War II, he found himself a major in the JAG Corps, assigned to the port of Seattle, but he was stationed in the remote town of Prince Rupert, way up on the north coast of British Columbia. And that's where he and Captain Howard Lloyd prosecuted DUIs, AWRLs, important stuff. In fact, if Tom Hanks were going to be cast as being a hero in World War II, they would not have cast him as Bill Meeks in Port Rupert, in Prince Rupert, rather, during World War II. But in October 1944, after Leon Jaworski filed the charges against dozens of Fort Lawton soldiers, Meeks and Lloyd were recalled to Seattle, and they were given, get this, just 10 days to prepare for the defense of 43 defendants. All of those defendants were facing charges that at the maximum they could face life in prison. 3 were additionally facing charges that could lead to being executed. 10 days. So who were these defendants and who were the victims? Throughout most of its history, Fort Lawton was segregated. During World War II, almost all the fort's soldiers were white, even though soldiers arrived from all around the country, only to then be sent to battlefields across the Pacific. Black soldiers at Fort Lawton were housed and fed in a separate area in the most remote northwest corner that you could possibly get in the fort. It was known to everyone, black and white, simply as the colored area. Now, throughout the American military, black soldiers were primarily assigned to what were called service units, kitchens, maintenance, motor pools, and the like. Black companies were commanded by white officers, and blacks were given few opportunities to move up the ranks. And that's because until late in the war, relatively few black soldiers, sailors, or airmen were given a chance to prove themselves on the front lines of combat. In late 1942, American and other allies stormed the beaches of Morocco on the western coast of North Africa. And they quickly pushed east. They were led by famous names like Patton and Bradley. And on the other side of North Africa, over in Egypt, British troops were led by General Montgomery, and they pushed west, engaging the famous German General Rommel. And by May 1943, both sides of the East-West Vice reached Tunisia. German and Italian soldiers had nowhere else to go. And at Cape Bon, at the very top right of that map, in Tunisia, 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered. Under the newly created Geneva Conventions, the Allies had obligated themselves to humane treatment of its prisoners of war, and Americans took that more responsibly than most. POW camps sprung up across the American South. They picked the South because that's where Army war planners figured they could save money, not having to worry about winterizing or winter-type clothing. And then in September 1943, Italy surrendered, long before either Germany or Japan surrendered. And that left the Allies in a quandary. They couldn't just ship Italian prisoners of war back to Italy because all the transport ships that we were using were already in use fighting the war. And even if they did have available ships, much of Italy was still occupied by Germans. And they couldn't just simply turn the Italians loose in America because an unknown number of Italians were still either openly or secretly loyal or sympathetic to the fascist cause. So what did they do? Well, the American military had a manpower problem. It was fighting a world war and had long ago started conscripting recruits that didn't meet their initial standards, people with less education or differently abled physical conditions. And suddenly, they saw an opportunity to instead employ Italians. Italians who were willing to swear that they were no longer loyal to the fascists, Italians who could be employed in the very same service sector jobs that black soldiers were then being used as manpower. You know, motor pool, maintenance, kitchens, that sort of thing. And that in turn gave black soldiers, for the first time, real opportunities to finally go to the front lines and try to prove themselves in actual battle. The new units were called Italian service units. So they quickly were deployed to forts and military installations all across the United States. They were given uniforms. They ate the same chow as American GIs. They even got paid the same as the American soldiers. But they were still technically prisoners, and they were quartered in their own barracks. And where do you suppose at Fort Lawton the white military commanders decided that they would put the Italian service units? Of course, right next to the colored area. In August 1944, there were 3 all-black companies. That's approximately 200 men per company, housed and in training at Fort Lawton. They were port companies, which involved the backbreaking labor of loading and unloading ships, something that they would soon be assigned to do in the South Pacific battle zones. The second week of August 1944, members of 2 of the all-black port companies learned that they'd soon be shipping out. They'd be going somewhere in the Pacific, probably in the middle of the month. And sure enough, on August 14th, they were told to pack their belongings and get ready to head to overseas the next morning. Now, these were young men, most of them. A few of them that night decided that, well, what are we going to do? This very well might be our very last night on American soil. I mean, the war had been going on for a while. You knew what happened when people relating to you or had been friends had been shipped overseas. A lot of them didn't come back. So that night, some of them stayed in their barracks and wrote letters to wives or friends or girlfriends, parents. A few of them stayed in their bunks reading their Bibles, but many, many more did what young soldiers did then and have always done when they know that their time in battle is approaching. They drank, they gambled, they sought out companionship. But on that very same August 14th evening, several Italians were also letting loose. You see, it had been more than a year now since almost a year since Italy had surrendered. And the White House and the Pentagon were growing concerned about the fate of post-war Italy. Germans had finally been cleared out, but Italy was in ruins and it struggled to form a governing coalition. More ominously, the Soviet Union was already making its moves in Eastern Europe. And there was very real fear in the West that Italy could be next. So on that same August 14th evening, you need to know that to mollify the anxious Italian authorities, the Pentagon had agreed to give POWs across the country more freedoms. They allowed them to go on field trips. They allowed them to have dinner in the homes of Italian-American families, including many here in Seattle. And they were even given the chance to secure passes to go into town where they could eat and drink and dance and party. And on that fateful night, 4 Italians returned to Fort Lawton after a night of drinking in Seattle, downtown Seattle. And as they passed through the colored area, they encountered a handful of Black American soldiers. And sure, some of those soldiers had also been drinking. Words were exchanged. One of the Black GIs took offense, and in the darkness, he charged toward the Italians. Fists flew very briefly. The Italians suddenly ran away and ran down the hill to their barracks, and the Black GI lay bleeding and unconscious. Word quickly spread in the American barracks that a fellow soldier had fallen. 2 Americans, including Private Samuel Snow, chased after the Italians. But just minutes later, they both came stumbling back, covered with blood. So by now, their fellow soldiers were pretty well convinced that they were under attack. They grabbed sticks, they grabbed rocks and bricks, and they stormed down a steep embankment to those Italian barracks that were next door. For the next 45 minutes, in the dark of night, a chaotic, violent melee continued unabated. The Italians and a few of the Americans that were assigned as their supervisors and interpreters, they got the worst of it. There were cuts, bruises, broken bones, concussions. Finally, just before midnight, military police in army jeeps belatedly arrived and restored order. The very next morning, before dawn's first light, 2 MPs, one white, one black, came across the lifeless body of Private Guglielmo Olivoto, an Italian prisoner of war. Olivoto had been lynched, hung by a noose that had been attached to an obstacle course guy wire at the base of the Magnolia Bluffs. The riot in Guglielmo Olivoto's death drew headlines around the world. New York Times, the Time magazine, even the Hindustan Times of India covered the fact that somehow an Italian POW in the custody of America, the one country that had championed the most Geneva Convention, had somehow died a brutal death. Pentagon officials were humiliated. And we now know that they demanded that justice had to be done and that someone was going to pay. Entered Leon Jaworski. In 1944, he was already an experienced wartime JAG prosecutor, and not long after the lynching, he arrived here in Seattle. He spent the next 3 months leading the investigation, the criminal investigation. And from a list of 200 Black soldiers who were initially identified as suspects, not long after that, he brought it down to charges against 43 men. And then, of course, Bill Beeks was appointed the defense attorney, assisted by Howard Noyd, to defend those 43 men. Court-martial was convened, led by a law member and 8 other Army officials, all of them officers, all of them white. The trial lasted more than 5 weeks, the longest U.S. Army trial of the war. And Jaworski's theory of the case was that Fort Lawton's Black soldiers were deeply bitter about the freedoms that had been accorded to the Italians. In a nutshell, Jaworski argued that they were upset that Italian prisoners of war received treatment that was basically on par with Black American soldiers, and even though both were inferior to the treatment that they believed were allowed to white soldiers, Certainly, they resented, said Jaworski, not being treated better than their former enemy. In Jaworski's telling, it was that deep resentment, fueled by alcohol, that explains the riot and the lynching. And at the end of the trial, after the jury of officers deliberated for 12 hours, they found 28 of those soldiers guilty of rioting, and 2 of those 28 also guilty of manslaughter in the death of Private Olivoto. Their sentences ranged from 6 months to 25 years of hard labor. All were busted back in rank. All were then denied their pay, and all were told that they would be dismissed from the Army with dishonorable discharges. Now, Beeks had some reason to be at least a little satisfied given what he had, because no one got life in prison, no one was sent to the firing squad, but Jaworski, as we all at least initially came to assume, had in fact prevailed, and it did in fact seem to launch his marvelous career. 4 years ago, Leslie and I moved here to Seattle from Oregon. We raised a family. Leslie worked for the U.S. Forest Service for a lot of that time, and I was a young general assignment reporter at NBC affiliate King TV. In 1986, while on an unrelated assignment, I learned about Olivoto's grave, and it's still there to this day over at Fort Lawton. You go see it anytime you want in the military cemetery there. When I first saw the inscription for his grave, I was stunned. Why was an Italian soldier in Seattle during World War II? When I went back to the office, I couldn't just Google it. There was no Google in 1986. And so I headed to the bowels of the Seattle Public Library, down in the basement where they kept the microfilm, the microfiche, and the black and white copies of all of the newspapers from the Seattle area and beyond. And I scanned the headlines for August 14th, 1944. There was lots of war news, but nothing at all about a lynching in Fort Lawton on August 14th. So I pulled up the newspapers after a while for August 15th, 1944, and still nothing at all. But on August 16th, 1944, in bold capital letters in all of the newspapers were the headlines, "More than 50 soldiers in riot. Italian prisoner of war lynched, 200 Negro soldiers held as suspects." And I looked at those and I said, a riot and a lynching in Seattle? And it was black people charged with being the perpetrators of a lynching? And as I continued my search, the riot and the lynching appeared in the newspapers for days and weeks and months, and not just local newspapers, but newspapers all around the country and around the world. And I had to look at myself and say, how did I never hear of this? How did I not know about this? And when I picked up the phone to call historians, lawyers, academics, military scholars, civil rights activists, not a single one of them knew anything at all about this. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is red meat for a reporter. Over the next year, I managed to locate 5 of the black soldiers, 4 of them in Texas. I found Beeks' assistant, Howard Noy, still living here in King County at the time. And I found a few Italian Americans whose families had hosted some of the prisoners of war. And I helped produce a documentary for King TV, and if you'd seen it, it would have gone something like this. By the way, that's me. You should never have pictures of yourself from a long time ago. That was a long time ago. The story was, wow, this happened here in Seattle. Leon Jaworski, Bill Beeks. And oh yeah, black soldiers accused of lynching, sure, but you know, here's some interviews with them, and well, they were convicted, and you know, what are people who are in jail going to say? They're going to say they're innocent, right? And the documentary got some attention, and it won some really nice awards. And like Leon Jaworski, I went on with my career. For a decade, I produced long-form reports and documentaries for CNN, and a special unit that was created by Ted Turner himself back in those days. But then starting in 2001, Leslie and I formed our own production company, and we've continued making documentaries ever since. I, too, had let time smooth an obvious jagged rock. Because over the years, people who I'd worked with on that documentary, or people who knew about the documentary, could come up to me and say, isn't there something weird about that story? I mean, black men charged with a lynching? And a story that had been in newspapers all around the world, and none of us know anything at all about it? And I said, sure, but it happened way back in 1944, and most of those people are now dead, and what are you going to do? Well, by now, a lot of time had passed since I had done that documentary. We're now in the early 2000s. Leslie and I have started our production company. And as we sat around the kitchen table one day, we talked about how that documentary had relied on secondary sources. For the most part, we had relied on newspapers and magazines and the like. But over the years, we had learned that, like any decent journalist should know, I suppose, how notoriously unreliable secondary sources could be. And in this case in particular, we had to, and did not really pay attention initially, to the fact that the reporters covering that 1944 trial, all of them were white. Most of them were male. Almost all of them were patriotically and understandably rooting for America to win the war. Maybe even most thought that the Army was probably right, because it was the Army. And even if the Army didn't know what it was doing, the Army still had the legal right to censor in advance things that before they were published, if they determined that something might be a threat to national or military security. That's still true today. They might even decide to censor something because it was inconvenient or embarrassing. And in the year since I had first laid eyes on Olivedo's headstone, Leslie and I instead came to appreciate the value of primary sources, not secondary, but primary sources, particularly contemporaneous statements by witnesses or investigators, especially when they're under oath. And without access to primary sources, the Fort Lawton lynching would remain a mystery. Or frankly, in our case, it remained a story not yet told. So we found a literary agent. She found an editor and a publisher, and with a very modest advance, we set out to look for more of the story. We assembled the names of more than 300 people that we knew were in some way associated with this trial. Google was even then still a pretty small operation, and it was not yet on everybody's PC. So Leslie applied her rather considerable research skills, and believe it or not, all those years later was able to find the last known address of a pretty large chunk, almost all of those 300 people, black, white, Italian, civilians, officers, enlisted men. Now remember, this was the Army, so very few of these people were from anywhere near the Northwest. They were all over the country. Black soldiers in particular were from either the Deep South, places like Texas and Louisiana and Arkansas, or they were from the upper Midwestern major cities like Chicago, Milwaukee, Detroit. So we packed our Volvo station wagon and we headed out across the country. We went to large cities and tiny towns. We went to major universities with big libraries and archives. We went to small black churches that had family registers. And we visited most of our country's best African-American museums. And we went to what turned out to be the gold mine of primary sources, the National Archives. We went to the regional archives here in Seattle and in Denver. We visited the FDR Library in Hyde Park, New York, and the Harry Truman Library in Kansas City. And at those two libraries, we actually got to sit where FDR had sat himself, and we read through astonishing handwritten notes that had briefed President Roosevelt and General Eisenhower on just what Jaworski was up to up there in Seattle in this trial. They were telling the president and Eisenhower about this thing Jaworski was doing in Seattle. And we also read reports by J. Edgar Hoover, who gave us a lot of insight about what the FBI thought about its fellow black citizens. But the motor load of all turned out to be in College Park, Maryland, home to the National Archives and Record Administration's main records depository. Naive as hell, we walked into that building and said, hey, show us all the records about the 1944 court-martial at Fort Lawton. Well, as it turns out, that's not how it works. There are literally billions of documents under the possession of the National Archives. Some are carefully cataloged, most of them are not. We were able to locate the archivist there who was the big specialist in World War II, and he told us that there were shelves filled with boxes, in turn filled with files, just under the category World War II court-martials. And if we wanted to try to find something about the Fort Lawton court-martial, then we'd have to look at them one card at a time. Of course, how hard can it be, right? It was the biggest trial. So every morning we'd be first in line. We did that so we could sit in our favorite chair over by the window. We'd pick up another couple of carts full of boxes. We'd pull out the files, look at them one at a time. And each night we were usually the very last ones to leave. We'd grab something to eat, we'd go to sleep, we'd wake up, we'd grab our coffee, we'd go first in line, and we did that day after day. We looked through those boxes and we looked, and we looked, and we found nothing at all about the Fort Lawton court-martial, the largest Army court-martial of the war, in the archive section for U.S. court-martials. So we went back to our archivist and we said, well, you know, there's other places you can look, other categories. Try provost marshals or prisoners of war. He said, by the way, we even have a section called Fort Lawton. So newly energized, we requested more boxes, and we looked, went to bed, woke up, got in line, came back, and there was nothing at all about this court-martial, even in the section called Fort Lawton. Now, we've been away from home for a long time, and we had long ago spent our modest advance, and so I was ready to conclude that either the records were not in these archives, or that, you know, somebody had destroyed them, but not Leslie. So without me, she went back to our archivist, and he looked at her and he said, you know, you seem like the persistent type. And he said, we do have a lot of our records in a section that we call miscellaneous. And so, yes, we started ordering carts and files and boxes from miscellaneous. And we went through incredible histories of things that happened in World War II. Many of them were gems that ended up in our book. Every morning, day after day, couldn't find anything about it until one day. We were at our regular table over by the window. I was looking through some file or another. Leslie taps me on the shoulder and says, Jack, look at this. And what she had found were the first pages of what turned out to be thousands of pages of a report formerly marked confidential, formerly, that contained enough details and damning information to eventually lead us to conclude that Jaworski had hidden exculpatory evidence from the defendants and from Beeks, and that Beeks would have most certainly used to be able to acquit most or all of the defendants if Jaworski had only made them available. Those documents, complete with the transcripts of dozens of contemporaneous interrogations of Italians, blacks, whites, officers, enlisted men, they all came to be known as the Cook Report, named after this man, this extraordinary inspector general named General Elliot Cook, whom I might add was sent there simply because, although Jaworski was there to prosecute the crime, Cook was there because the Army was so mortifiedly embarrassed that this had happened at all. So they sent him to Fort Lawton at about the same time to find out what the hell went on. He interviewed essentially anyone and everyone, records that, of course, we had never seen or known about. That Cook Report proved to be the smoking gun. And our book, On American Soil, was pretty much based on what we finally learned from that. We documented and reported multiple instances of racial bias, intimidation, false testimony, and horrifically sloppy and inadequate criminal investigation. And we identified the likely suspect in Olivoto's murder, the one person with the means, the motive, and the opportunity, a white military policeman from the Mississippi River Delta by the name of Clyde Vernon Lomax. A white man? You see, it turns out that there was actually very little evidence of animosity between black soldiers toward Italians. It was instead actually animosity by white soldiers toward Italians. And here's why. Remember all that freedom that the Italian prisoners were enjoying? Well, in many instances, reported in case after case in newspapers all around the country, young American girls whose boyfriends were off fighting the war, not girls, women, were off fighting the war overseas, chose to enjoy the company of visiting Italians. These Italian prisoners could dance, they could sing, they could cook, and when the dancing turned to dating, white soldiers grew furious. And especially at Fort Lawton. Jaworski had hid the fact that night after night, white soldiers would get into fights with Italian prisoners, often threatening them to stay away from American white women. And that white MP, Clyde Lomax, was usually present at those confrontations. Not only that, he was the first one on the scene immediately after that brief fist fight that I described between the intoxicated black soldier and the intoxicated Italian prisoner. He then had several opportunities once it started to get a little bit aggressive and eventually became a riot. He had several opportunities to go get the rest of the MPs. Didn't do a thing, sat there and watched it. And the MP who discovered Olivoto's body in the pre-dawn dark the next morning was Clyde Lomax. Somehow in the darkness, he knew where to look. Worst of all, immediately after those 28 black soldiers were eventually convicted, some of rioting, some of manslaughter, the Army quietly court-martialed Clyde Lomax, charging him only with abandoning his post because, you see, he disappeared. No one saw him during the time period in which they assumed that Olivoto was hung. And they simply kicked him out of the Army. After the book was published, Seattle Congressman Jim McDermott introduced a bill demanding that the U.S. Army reopen the case based on the formerly classified documents that we had revealed in our book that Leslie had uncovered. When the Army Armed Services Committee, which is where it was, stalled, my mother, a former school teacher, wrote a passionate letter to her member of Congress asking why nothing had been done. She wrote that letter without ever telling us that she did it. And she wrote it without knowing that her member of Congress just happened to be the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. And a constituent letter made all the difference because a former JAG officer on that committee staff was given the job of vetting very quietly our book, all of the things that we had maintained in there. And he came back a year later, to the committee and said, yeah, this bill should pass. And out of the blue, Leslie and I were over at UW one day, and the phone rang, and we get a call, and it's the Pentagon. And the Pentagon says, excuse me, do you have the addresses of any of the men who, back in 1944, were convicted of rioting and murder at Fort Lawton? And we're like, well, some of them, why? What's going on? And sure enough, then the Pentagon was given the responsibility to try to say, did we make a mistake? Another year passed, though, and more lawyers looked at it all, until finally on October 27, 2007, the Army Board for the Correction of Military Records, in a unanimous decision, ruled that Jaworski had committed egregious error in his prosecution of the Fort Lawton court-martial, denying defendants a meaningful right of counsel, and denying fundamental due process under the Articles of War that were in place at that time. They set aside all of the convictions. They reinstated the honorable discharges that had been taken away. And get this, they ordered that the men or their surviving family members be paid reparations for the back pay that they had been denied. Now, I've taken my allotted time, but there is more to the story. And even though most of the world has forgotten about this case, one of the lasting legacies is a major revision of military justice in this country. At both the FDR and the Harry Truman libraries, Leslie and I found in those handwritten notes from presidential advisors reference that they knew that the Fort Lawton prosecutions and convictions were suspicious, if not flawed. And they used those, they cited those, among other reasons, as compelling reasons to both desegregate the military and a few years later to abolish the Articles of War in favor of the Uniform Code of Military Justice.
Jack tells a very compelling story here, but you should be on the trail with him at Discovery Park and hear that story. And I have had two occasions to do that. The first one with Judge Jones and Congressman Lewis, and the second one when I was on the Judicial Conference Executive Committee. We don't have pictures of that one, but Merrick Garland was part of that too, and he took the tour with Jack and Leslie and was deeply moved by that experience. And on that tour, I also took with us Rita Bender, who some of you know, a Seattle attorney, who before she married Bill Bender and was in Seattle, was actually married to Mickey Schwimmer, one of the Mississippi civil rights workers who were killed back then. And she fought hard to see justice done for those individuals. And she was part of this walk where we saw another indication of how African-American soldiers and civil rights people were abused, defeated, punished unfairly. So we're going to hear now from Judge Richard Jones. Can we play that one now, Tony?
Yes.
Okay.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Judge Lasnik, for the opportunity, and thank you for your foresight and wisdom in commemorating this very special event and occasion. Please know that I would be here with you and all of you today, except for one reason. My brother's turning 90, and I've always prided myself in making the determination that family always comes first. But for that celebration and that birthday, I would be here with all of you today. But this gives me an opportunity to share with you briefly my experience on that walk with Congressman McDermott and Judge Lasnik and just a few others as we took that historical visit with Leslie and Jack Hamann. And they shared with us an opportunity to look at a part of our history that many people think wasn't a part of history in Seattle. Many people believe racism has never been a part of our community. Many people think that that just happened down south. Jim Crow didn't exist in the Northwest. It certainly didn't exist in Seattle. But that's a far cry from the experience that Leslie and Jack Hamann presented to us. Now, did I know that I have any knowledge or information about what had happened to those soldiers? I did. Did I read it in a book? No. Did I watch a documentary? No. Did someone tell me about it? Yes. And the people that told me about it were other black lawyers and judges. And those other black lawyers and judges included Judge Charles Johnson, Carl Maxey, Gary Gayton, just to name a few. These were individuals, it was a part of their history because they grew up in the community experiencing the same and similar challenges to what took place and that visit that we experienced at Discovery Park. Now, in my career, in my lifetime, I had the opportunity to meet with and spend time with some of the notables in civil rights history. And they included Rosa Parks, Julian Bond, Andrew Young, Diane Nash, Reverend C.T. Vivian. And these are people whose names that you've never heard of or don't know about. And if you don't, then shame on you. You should go back and do a little bit more research on your history of what took place in the civil rights movement. But I can tell you, of all the individuals that I've had the chance to personally sit down and talk with, I've never been more humbled by the opportunity that I had to spend with Congressman John Lewis. Now, when we met, he thanked me for my service. Now imagine that, Congressman John Lewis thanking me for my service. As I grabbed his hand and we shook and locked eyes, all I could say was, thank you, Congressman, because but for your history, but for your life, I would not have the opportunity to hold the position that I now hold. Now, when we were walking that day, I remember walking behind Congressman Lewis, and I remember actually walking in his footsteps, thinking about how powerful a man this was. He wasn't a big man and big in stature, but he had a powerful hand grip. He had a powerful message that he had been sharing with us in our community for decades and for years. And here I was having an opportunity to spend that very special occasion with him. Now, I can tell you that I was in pain that day. And you may say, how could you possibly be in pain on that special occasion, a chance to spend time with Congressman Lewis? It wasn't that I was overwhelmed with Congressman Lewis as I was with feeling the pain of what those soldiers had to go through at that particular time. Now, I wish I could have been a part of the justice system to go back and make a difference in what was taking place, what they had done to right the ship, to correct these injustices and these wrongs. But I knew that that wasn't reality, because even if I had had a chance to be catapulted back in history, put it in context, the very first African-American federal judge in this country was not until 1937, and that was William Hastie. So when I think about how I felt that day, I wish I could have been a part of the change. But my best opportunity was to continue to try and be a part of the change in this country and try and make sure justice is always done in front of me every time I walk out on the bench. Now here I was, standing next to a man, Congressman Lewis, who had been beaten, shot at, imprisoned, spat upon, and he always showed courage and never fear. And I believe he probably ascribed to the principle that when fear knocks at your door and faith answers, no one will be there. That's the kind of man that John Lewis was. And here I was next to him, walking with him and hearing his words as he absorbed the impact of what you're about to hear this afternoon. Now, Dr. King gave a special presentation or speech many years ago, and it was called the Drum Major Instinct. And it was about leadership and legacy. And Dr. King was saying that he wanted to be a drum major for peace, a drum major for righteousness. And when he passed on, he wanted to leave a committed life behind. Now, Dr. King was not just speaking about himself. He was not just talking about the committed life he wanted to leave behind. Dr. King was also talking about the others that were around him. And the others included his anointed successor, whether it was by his designation or others, or just happened to rise to the occasion. Congressman John Lewis stepped up and has continued to step up until he passed. Now, when you leave today, you have the opportunity to do two things. One, create justice or create injustice. Now, the injustice part is if you just listen to what you hear today and say, that was interesting, and you went back to work and stopped thinking about it. The justice that you have the opportunity today is to take what you learned today, go home and talk about it, share it with others, tell others that they missed out on a wonderful opportunity to get history that had not been revealed, disclosed, or discovered in any other way. Now, I had the benefit of our black legal griots the men I mentioned who were black lawyers and justices to pass on African American history. You didn't have the benefit of that, but you do have the benefit of the investigative reporting that was done. I hope you take advantage of what you learned today and do something with it. Thank you.
Such a great video by Judge Jones, right? Yeah. You know, there are a number of black judges who Judge Jones talked about. In the book, the only one that I personally knew was Charles Stokes, who was a Seattle District Court judge when I started out as a prosecutor, and very dignified man. And you know, the district court in those days, I'm talking about county district court, not this district court, was not a court of record. You had a right to a new trial if you wanted to in Superior Court. So no court reporters or anything like that. And there were some pretty crazy situations that would happen in there. And one of Judge Stokes' favorite rulings was he'd make an objection and he would say, "Sauce for the goose, counsel." Sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. I let you do it. I'm going to let him do it. And it was very interesting. But Nick, when you see, I can't call this a Brady violation because Brady didn't exist in 1944, but when you see the way Jaworski kept that Cook report from the defense and kept it on his counsel table and used it for his purposes, it's kind of shocking, isn't it?
Yes, Jim, thank you, Your Honor. It's, you know, our group of federal prosecutors being at the forefront of fairness and justice is principle, and we're not just trying to win. And I think the lesson from that case and many others throughout our history and frankly our present are people that are motivated by victory rather than justice. And so, you know, there are lots of protections now that did not exist then, both in the civilian judicial system and in the military justice system. But it is abhorrent to me as a minister of justice in this role, and having been a military prosecutor myself and a military defense lawyer myself, to think that literally sitting on the counsel table was the truth. And what he did because he wanted to win, or at least had a vision of what he thought was fair and just, or maybe he was ambitious, and maybe Jack has a perspective on what motivated him to do what he did, but it is remarkable that he proceeded in that way. And thankfully, we have a lot more protections built into the system, but it is beyond the rule changes and the court cases. It is the people that we hire to have these awesome responsibilities as judges and as prosecutors, and making sure we're empowering the right people with the right character to make those decisions.
There's no substitute, though, for having an African American in a leadership position who can make the difference between, am I going to go this way or am I going to go that way? And you have that power now, and some of your colleagues do, but that was not always the case, not just in 1940s, but the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, even 2000s and 2010s. It's kind of a new thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I'm the first black U.S. attorney in the history of the state. The class of U.S. attorneys that were appointed by President Biden is the most diverse class of U.S. attorneys in the history of this country. When we gather together, it is remarkable to see that of the 94 U.S. attorneys, I think 65 of whom are now presidentially appointed, there's almost 30 of us who are people of color. And, you know, being the only voice in the room does not necessarily change the dynamic. And frankly, just being a person of color does not change the dynamic. It's someone who is also willing to lead with intention about talking about these issues, bringing more just perspectives. And so being a person of color and making people feel good about having diversity in and of itself is not a tool for justice. It's a collective action. It's also intentional action beyond those decision makers. But it's great to see a class of prosecutors with that racial diversity and professional diversity. You know, I think folks know that this is the most diverse class of judges that have come to the bench in a very long time. We have that here, but you know, across the country, more black women appointed to the appellate courts than any other time in history. These types of things matter, and they matter when there's people collectively bonded together, because doing it by yourself is not easy, but do it with a class of peers and colleagues, gives you the opportunity to make these changes.
Let me give you a real-world example of what I'm talking about. In 2020, during the George Floyd protests, riots, etc., in Bellevue, there were a couple of people who stormed a jewelry store and took some things. Now, the real jewels were gone. They were not very expensive things. Most of the people were charged in state court with robbery. 2 young African-American males were singled out for federal charges under the Hobbs Act with long prison terms, even though they had no criminal records and no weapons were utilized. But they were charged with these very serious robbery offenses. And Peter Camille, one of the lawyers for those people, along with Vanessa Pye Thompson, brought motions to dismiss. The case was assigned to me. Motions to dismiss, selective prosecution, prosecutorial discretion abuses, all sorts of things. These are tough legal issues to win. And I said, when the first time we had a Zoom hearing to the assistant U.S. attorney handling the case, why were these people singled out for federal charges with these long sentences? And I didn't get a very good answer. But this is when President Trump and his attorney general were told, we got to crack down on these demonstrators and show them that they can't do what they're doing and make an example out of a couple of people. And so I said to the assistant U.S. attorney, you have a new boss, the first African-American U.S. attorney ever in the state of Washington. Would you please just go to him and say, Judge Lasnik would like you to look at this and decide for yourself, is this something you want to do?
No pressure.
No pressure. No pressure. And I'm telling you, the assistant U.S. attorney, even on Zoom, you can see it looked ill, and I got one. But it was reported back in a couple of weeks that the United States attorney had decided to dismiss the federal charges and charge in state court. Now, that's not going to happen if you don't have somebody with an experience like Nick Brown has, a sensitivity to history, and a desire to see justice done. So there's a real-world example of what we're talking about. So Professor Fan, she wants me to call her Mary, but I just can't do it. But if you call me Bob, I'll hold you in contempt. But you have had some experience with the International Court of War Crimes and the like. From that perspective, what do you see when you look at this case? You know, in obviously the rearview mirror of a long time, but you've seen some events throughout the world that must have shocked your conscience a lot more than this riot on Fort Lawton.
I mean, there's really fascinating parallels. I mean, why did Jaworski cut these corners? He wanted to be a part of the first major international criminal prosecution. It's really exciting to be a part of history. And so I see all these powerful, amazing people in this room, and you think, hey, you're doing amazing things. And you have all these dreams and ambitions, and it's a cautionary tale for all of us because we have big goals. We want to be a part of history. We want to be a part of these movements, but there are people whose lives, who are real people in these cases. They're not just symbols or stepping stones to a bigger goal. And, and this is a challenge that we see in international criminal justice as well. Atrocities happen in the fog of war. The world is watching. Why was there so much pressure in this trial here in Fort Lawton? Because the world was watching. There was a powerful chapter in this book about the media, the scrutiny around the world, and how that could have affected some of the decisions that were made in this case. Well, that's even greater on the international criminal level. It's really striking, this notion, well, a lot of people were involved in beating up a lot of Italian prisoners of war. One person died, but a number of people were seriously injured as well. And there's this notion, well, we'll just prosecute. Some of them must have been involved, right? And there's this thing, like, we lose the individuality of the people that are whose lives, whose future are at stake. And it's a challenging thing because in the international criminal context, we have the fog of war. We don't know who did what, oftentimes. And we have actually similar challenges. I'm reading this book, and I'm thinking, and they're just thinking, and there's this really unusual prosecution theory. Well, you blew a whistle saying that one of your colleagues got punched out. You blew the whistle, and so that somehow led to the hanging of the private. There's this use of extended web of liability that's used in this case. And what's haunting to me as someone who worked in the international criminal context is I had the privilege of working with one of the great architects of international criminal law today, Nino Cassese. One of his great inventions was, among many other things, joint criminal enterprise doctrine, sometimes known as JCE, sometimes known as just convict everyone. And why? It's because, I don't know what you did. There's a lot of people, many hands led to a lot of injuries. You know what? As long as I can prove that you were part of this group, I'm gonna hold you liable for all the killings, the maimings, the injuries. I'm gonna hold you liable for war crimes and crimes against humanity. So what's really interesting is Jaworski, he kind of pursues this unusual theory in Fort Lawton. America and American prosecutors have had a lot of impact in the Nuremberg Tribunal in terms of concepts of liability. We have here in the United States some of the widest webs of liability with our conspiracy doctrine, with our accomplice liability doctrine. When civil lawyers, the predominant mode of justice around the world is civil law, when they hear about our sticky webs of liability, they are horrified because they believe in individual guilt, individual moral responsibility. And they don't think, well, hey, you know what, good enough if I can prove you were part of this group, and even if it wasn't intended, what happened, good enough to hold you liable, because we have you. We don't have the other guy. We don't even know who the other guy is, but we have you. And so I think there are haunting echoes, actually, in the challenges carried forward into the international criminal context. And I don't think it's a mistake, because what happened? Jaworski went to the international context, and what's amazing is Beeks, the hero of this book, who I hear from Jack later turned out to be a get off my lawn kind of guy. Like he'd yell at the kids, get off my lawn! I thought, sorry, it was a great story. I was really sad when I heard it because I thought Beeks was such a hero in this book. But Beeks so impressed Jaworski that Jaworski took him to the international criminal context. That's amazing, that partnership across the aisle, But where did they make their chops? Where do they learn their prosecution when it comes to collective action? Here in this trial. So I think it's really interesting, the echoes from the international criminal context.
Yeah, and Jack, Jaworski, he didn't seem to have a great rapport with his defendants, and he wanted to sort of convince some of them not to testify, which they ended up.
Beeks did not.
Beeks, and some of them regretted not testifying at the end. Did you get any sense that Beeks was any kind of Gregory Peck out of To Kill a Mockingbird, or was he just a zealous advocate within the context of white military JAG officers?
Well, I have to preface that with giving you my source. His assistant, Howard Noyd, remained an attorney here in King County for decades afterwards. And am I too close? Okay, I have to make sure I get.
No, I am too far away.
You're too, okay. Howard Noyd, brilliant man, just passed away a couple of years ago, was a phenomenal source for us because he was there with Jaworski every step of the way. And to answer your question, it was a matter of expediency. Put yourself in his position. You give him 10 days, and Noyd openly said, look, I was from Iowa, and it wasn't until I went to college that I saw another person who wasn't a white Swedish American. Interestingly, to his credit, he was at Drake University. He was part of the student body who went and sat in at luncheon counters when those counters refused to serve fellow black students. But he wasn't by any means somebody who considered himself a civil rights activist. He was just a guy who said, well, I wasn't raised that way. That's not what my religion taught me. And in Beeks' case, Beeks said, look, if you're only going to give me 10 days, my goal better be don't let any of them get killed or thrown in jail forever. And you know, this, boy, I'll tell you, so many of the points you guys have made are just so spot on, and of course, that's why it's a book and not just a half-hour talk, but the pyramid of which injustice can occur. And I want all of us, please, to think in the context of people now trying to come across the border and the way they're treated, or people who are Muslim Americans and the way that they've been treated ever since 9/11. How we think, well, maybe America's progressing out of certain things, but suddenly some other comes up and we set a whole new set of rules. And most importantly, just as Judge Lasnik said, there's really no person at a level of authority who might put on the brakes and say, hey, well, so here in there, even if you were the most accomplished, as you learn about one of these defendants, who had all sorts of brain power and talent, you were stuck being in the port company. Because why? Because overseas they didn't allow units to be integrated. They had to be segregated. And so in this case, he was a medic. Sorry, we're not going to put you, the medic, in with white soldiers. They won't be treated by a black man. So he didn't have a pattern of path up to where he might eventually be, say, on the prosecution team, or even on the law judge team that was judging these men. And so it's truly a case where those things that are initially appear to be a small problem end up multiplying themselves when someone in the room could have said, hold it, wait a minute, you're not asking the right questions here. Or hold it, wait a minute, where can we go? None of those brakes were applied because it was all male, all white, all officer. One thing Beeks did was he made sure no Southern whites were on the scene.
And you know, the African-American soldiers who were stationed in Europe all described being treated so well over there. They didn't get the kind of racism that they got. And again, the Southern might be the worst, but let's face it, it was happening in cities like Seattle and Chicago and New York and everywhere. And you quote a letter that was actually intercepted from a black Army private from Providence, Rhode Island, who sent it from Fort Lewis, who said, the truth is, there isn't a Negro here who feels his greatest enemy is Germany or Japan. The crimes committed by the Nazis and Japanese seem unreal and far away to them, while the crimes committed by Southerners in this country are known to all of us. Many of the boys in my barrack who come from the South can tell stories of being run out of town, threatened, intimidated. For every story of Nazi cruelty related, they can counter with an equally gruesome true story of Southern inhumanity. And you know, this whole idea of we're going to be stuck out here with the Italian POWs in the colored region definitely weighed on the minds of individuals. Nick, when you were in Iraq, what did you see in terms of, you know, how much progress had been made? I mean, it was 1948 that Harry Truman desegregated the military, but I'm sure it didn't happen instantly. How about in the early 2000s?
Well, sure. So, I mean, one of the things that I kept thinking about when reading this book and learning more about the story is, you know, there's so much to point to in the military, point to be critical of the military and all the players involved. But at the same time, I think we have to recognize that the military was leaps and bounds ahead of where the most of America was. It was the first major institution to integrate. It was the first major institution to have blacks and other people of color in leadership positions. Still to this day, there are more black generals than there are CEOs or people leading private companies or law firms, et cetera. So for all of the growth that the military has had to go through, it was far ahead and in many ways better in that institution than any other institution in American society. I'm a father or a child of two Army veterans. My father was a military officer for most of my childhood. I spent 4 years in active duty myself, and so I have a lot of affinity and pride for military service. And even just reading this book to see what both Jaworski and Meeks went on to become, they got their foundation in the JAG Corps, so we're on JAG Corps. But so I was in active duty for 4 years. I spent a year in Baghdad in 2005 as a defense lawyer defending soldiers over there. I kept thinking back to the vast majority or a good percentage of my clients in Baghdad were from the Louisiana National Guard. Those guys like to party and so got in trouble. And they were there activated fighting a war, and then we would get in trouble, and we would defend them, and we have full-on court-martials in Baghdad. And one of my most vivid memories was defending a staff sergeant accused of sexual assault in the middle of a war zone, where members of our jury were literally having to take breaks to go check on when a bomb would explode outside of the gates of our military institution. But I felt like the military was a great place to be a young black lawyer to start my career, because I felt like the military is all egalitarian and merit-based, and at least on paper, it does a better job of many institutions of recognizing merit and achievement beyond any other thing that might limit or your growth. But also, so many parallels to the cases I charged over there. Like, there was a push for expediency. You know, when you charge someone with a felony offense in a war zone, you know, most people's deployment was going to be a year or a year and a half, and so there was a push to get things done before people scattered back to the far ends of the earth. All my clients in Louisiana National Guard went back a little bit early because Hurricane Katrina hit. And so you can imagine what it might have been like to operate on a normal schedule for a criminal calendar, because these people would scatter and it'd be hard to do. So there was lots of institutional pressure to move the ball forward so we could resolve matters. And so still lots of procedural justice that I think the military has growth opportunities. But I'm also a proponent and advocate for recognizing the military as being one of the premier public institutions for giving black people the opportunity to lead. There's a 4-star general at JBLM, black man. Most folks don't know about that. His wife is a black woman, Army judge, retired colonel. You know, he is in charge of tens of thousands of individuals right now and their well-being and their families' well-beings. And we don't talk about these current leaders in this military service as much as we should. And so I'll stop there.
Okay.
Well, there's so much to say about this book.
Sure.
I think we could talk forever. But
And Professor Fan, as a professor dealing with law students, what do they see about, you know, this whole misinformation, disinformation controversy? You can't talk about critical race theory. We're going to pretend that the Japanese internment was not that big a deal, and that do they even fathom the difference between a segregated and an integrated society?
Well, Your Honor. May I do Socratic? I am so happy to see several of my students, both current and former, now sometimes in practice, sometimes now law clerks, in the audience. So I could very well kick it over to somebody to answer that. May I?
Yes, go right ahead.
Avoid eye contact with me if you don't want me to call on Tim. Speaking of military service, I'm gonna call on Tim because Tim is a veteran as well. And so, what are your thoughts?
Can I hear the question again?
Well,
Okay.
the question
Misinformation.
is, what do you think of attempts to, you know, use misinformation, disinformation? You know, slavery was not that big a deal. Japanese internment, we treated everyone very well, and there was no, you know, we're making too much of this, try to make the white man feel guilty movement.
I think law students see, they're immediately critical of people trying to eliminate history. At least that's been my experience with the students that I have. When it's pretty evident. I think if you look around at the way the world works and it's kind of the circular type of history, that you know people are always going to try to bury injustice. So yeah, I do think that at least at UW, students are very very critical of those attempts to kind of whitewash history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Professor Fan, when I went to UW Law School, there were no women of color teachers, there were no men of color teachers. Is the law school academic community totally different now?
I would say dramatically different. I'm chair of hiring oftentimes, and we're working hard. We want to create a pipeline. We have amazing students, and it's part of our mentorship as well, both in the law school community, but the national community as well, because it's so important to have a diverse palette of experiences, racial, ethnic experience too, We've been talking about the import of experience. I think Nick powerfully described that as well. And I think we need voices like that.
And Nick, you just got back from Selma, Alabama, and Montgomery, Alabama, and walking in the footsteps of Congressman Lewis, getting to meet Judge Myron Thompson, talking to Brian Stevenson down there. Tell me how that affected you.
So I'm chair of the Civil Rights Subcommittee for all U.S. attorneys in America, and we meet regularly via Zoom. We get to host one meeting, so we decided to host an in-person meeting in Selma and in Montgomery. So just got back from that on Tuesday. Frankly, I'm still sort of trying to process the entire trip, and going back to Selma was a powerful experience in and of itself. For those of you who have been, Selma itself has not changed much. Still incredibly poor, still fairly segregated, and you can see a community still striving for recognition and change in ways that are not dramatically different than they were in 1965 when Bloody Sunday happened. And then on Monday, we went back to Montgomery, met with Judge Thompson. Judge Thompson was one of the first black federal judges appointed by Judge Jimmy Carter in 1972, took over from Judge Johnson, who was the judge that ordered the permission of the Selma to Montgomery March, ordered the bus desegregation in 1956. And so to hear from him was super powerful. There's a wonderful little museum, the Freedom Rider Museum, that is right attached to the courthouse in Montgomery. And I was thinking about that as Jack was showing the picture of all the black GIs, because outside of the Freedom Rider Museum has all of the heroes, kids, frankly, that put their lives in the line to integrate buses, John Lewis, C.T. Vivian, all these other names known and unknown. And then we went to the Legacy Museum and the Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is Brian Stevenson's project. And to pick up a little bit on what Judge Jones was saying in his remarks, and I think others have touched on as well, the importance of engaging this history is so critical. And the Legacy Museum, which just opened a couple years ago, get yourself to Alabama and see it. And take your colleagues and your children and your parents and whomever. That is such a powerful museum, and it walks through the history of transnational slavery, from the Middle Passage to Jim Crow and segregation, to the parallels to what we're dealing with currently around mass incarceration and the issues in our justice system. And we spent about 3 hours in that museum. Brian, I can call him Brian now, but Brian opened it up for us on a day that it was closed, and the 30 of us walked through that museum. And the Memorial for Peace and Justice is the outdoor museum where you see these big monuments to all of the people that were lynched, both known and unknown, across America, including at least one documented case in Oregon. And then to hear from Brian, who was so generous with his time, talk to us about his career and the parallels to what he sees now. It was truly just a transformative experience, I think, for all of us to recognize that wasn't that long ago. We get past bad things in our history and think that we should then just recover and don't recognize how they linger and they're pervasive in our modern practices. And frankly, the tide in many ways has shifted back, and hate crimes in America are on the rise. Attacks against not only people of color, but religious minorities, LGBTQ people. Certainly during the last couple of years, to be Asian American in any major city in America was frightening because of the misinformation and disinformation that we're seeing spread across the country. And so to be able to experience a museum and hear from legends was so transformative. And one thing that Brian talked about with this all is that we can be driven by fear and anger in our decision making. And some of that was echoing to me from reading this book. They were fearful of, obviously, the black GIs. The military was fearful of the international reaction to a POW being killed. So those sort of emotions drove decision makings at the micro level to the macro level, all the way up to the White House and the Pentagon. And when we get away from using good judgment and using data and using all these things and best practices that allow for sound decision making, we get the types of injustices that Jack and Leslie uncovered. And it's also a reminder for me, this book, like I used to run on a weekly basis through Discovery Park. I used to live right by the Ballard Bridge. Most people in Seattle don't know there was a military base here, let alone that we had thousands of POWs, let alone that the biggest military case in American history happened 10 minutes from here. And shame on us, and there's lots of things to know about these days, and it's hard to keep track of it all. I was at SU Law School a few days ago, and they're showing a documentary about the hate crime murder of Vincent Chin. I had never heard of it. Asian American man beat to death by two white men who were upset about the perception of Japanese American taking their jobs in the car industry, beat to death and then walked. No prison whatsoever, conviction overturned, and most people, myself included, didn't know about that. And we have an obligation to do better and to learn from that. And I think that once you engage in that history, you walk away with, frankly, a lot of hope and a lot of recognition that things can get better, but only if we're aware of all that shared history.
So important point that Nick just made. And, Myron Thompson and I were chief judges at the same time. And he and I sat at the table once with a speech by a sitting Supreme Court justice, who I won't name. But, this whole idea that Martin Luther King was all about color blindness, and the way to stop racial discrimination is stop discriminating on the basis of race. And these are the people who want to do away with affirmative action and all those kinds of things. And Judge Myron Thompson leaned over to me and said, Bob, I've seen these people my whole life. Honey child them all day and lynch them all night. And that was right out of his mouth. But there's a lot of wisdom to it. And what Myron Thompson went through down there, I'm telling you, it was not easy. He was very young when he was appointed 32. But for the law students out there, if any of you don't know who Judge Frank Johnson was, please raise your hand. Yeah, I'm saying most young lawyers, most of my law clerks, I asked them about Frank Johnson, and I'm not sure who that is. And the federal judges in the Deep South who enforced the rulings on Brown versus Board of Education and other things, they were taking their lives in their hands. Frank Johnson's parents' home was firebombed because they thought that was where Frank was. It was not easy. Yet last year, when I put together the Federal Judges Association Quadrennial, and I got Brian Stevenson as our keynote speaker, and I got Jeff Robinson to talk about implicit bias and show the movie that he did, I had a bunch of judges cancel from the South. They were like, we don't want to hear about diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are federal district court and circuit court judges. So don't think even in 2023 that we've completely changed the United States when it comes to racial injustice. Jack, when there were powerful and significant black newspapers in those days, some of them really supported the GIs and could see that something was rotten in the state of Denmark. Others were really embarrassed about the African-American soldiers and felt they had tarnished their own race.
Okay, this is a great point. I'm glad you brought it up, because I never feel comfortable if I walk away from one of these, if you or anyone reads this book or knows this history and thinks that somehow one of these racial groups are a bunch of saints, another is a bunch of sinners, and the other is a bunch of victims. Because we try to be very clear in here that none of that is true. There were heroic members of that those black companies, and there were absolute snakes in the grass. There were absolutely honorable white soldiers and officers, and ones that were just miserable. And the same thing with the Italian groups. It was us. It was life. It was America. And these were young men, most of whom had either been through trauma, if you were the Italians, or you were worried about it. I mean, don't never forget, all of you Vietnam generation, if you're born in a certain year, It's like, okay, I'm going to Vietnam, I'm doing my duty. You get to a certain click in that and you're like, man, something's going on here. This is not all that it's been done. And eventually, and that's been true with every major engagement, we're in 1944 now. And I say all that because the black community was by no means, of course, some sort of monolith in this. I'm talking about the civilian community, who were, by the way, very heavily redlined at that point. If you were a black citizen, good luck getting a place. I wish Judge Jones was here. His family actually was part of that, where if you wanted to have a job here, Boeing would discriminate against you. Housing was near impossible to find, and within the black community, there was this huge schism between those who had been here for at least a generation or two, and this big group of people coming, usually from the South, who were looking for work and were putting greater strains on a very small world that they were allowed to live in or eat at. There were signs in Seattle, folks, in 1944 that said, no blacks. You could pick up the paper and you could read the ads for, what was pre-Macy's, I'm sorry, Bon Marché, that only would accept white applicants for the Christmas jobs. It would say that in the newspaper, you know, whites only. And so the black community was really, really divided on this issue. And there were some who then ended up turning their attention to this trial and doing one hell of a lot better job of covering this trial for their newspapers than the Times or the PI, or they had other newspapers back then, the Seattle Star, the Tacoma News Tribune. Folks from the community there understood some of these. They pointed out, wait a minute, how come the Army lost the murder weapon? You have this huge murder case, and they don't know where the murder weapon is? Well, there's some pretty interesting reasons why that might be convenient for Jaworski. Because as one of the black soldiers told me, how am I going to know how to do a noose? Who's going to teach me how to do a noose? And wouldn't it be pretty embarrassing if it turned out that the murder weapon was a noose that was done in a very specific way that someone, you know, would practice all the time, which is in fact what happened. But that's true with each of those jurisdictions, those groups, was you could find that. But the difference was this, and that is that there was a utter lack of constituent support beyond that in the larger community for those black soldiers. And you had to look for the occasional heroes, and one of the biggest ones of all, who doesn't get enough attention, was a mother by the name of Sadie Hughes. Her son was one of the defendants. She was the only one who was able to get on a train from South Chicago and come to Seattle and sit through the trial every single day. And at night, she would walk through the fort, and she would do that in order to test the theories that Jaworski was presenting, claiming that this person saw that person and could identify them without question. And I was over here, and I could see and tell that he was the one to do this. And she went there, and she's like, there's no way. There's no way. And there are actually engineering reports to confirm everything she said. And then she wrote the most unbelievable letter, it's in the book, to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Because for many people, many Americans, including a lot of black Americans, he was a bit of a savior. And she said, you know, I'm going to write you this personal letter because, and she went down and broke down everything that was wrong with Jaworski's case. This was a mom in 1944.
And she never got a letter back.
Never got a letter back, and of course she got it right, and it went undone for decades.
And you know, Tuesday I'm doing interviewing Judge Margaret McEwen, wrote a book of citizen justice about William O. Douglas, and in doing my research on Justice Douglas's time on the court, I read a portion of the Brethren that talked about in the mid-60s there was a caste system at the Supreme Court that the blacks held all the menial jobs, elevator man and valet and things like that, and whites had all the important jobs. You know, it was not something that disappeared in society, even though it disappeared first in the military based on what President Truman adopted. But boy, racial prejudice, what we have to do is look around at the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all those other things to see that we are still living this. You know, when I teach in this room civics teachers from middle school and high school as part of our civics training that we do for teachers here. I start out with the Constitution by saying the United States is a nation conceived in slavery and dedicated to the proposition that certain white men are created equal. That is how this country started, and there's no two ways about it. Now, we have come so far in the 200 plus years that we've been here, but we still have vestiges of that system in what we do, and we should always be vigilant and be aware of how these things are still happening in our society. And Nick, you had that period of time where you were an AUSA under John McKay and Jenny Durkin.
John quit the same day he hired me, so I never worked for him.
That's why he left, okay. But you know, you must have seen things back then in jury selection where blacks were kind of kicked off juries by certain AUSAs, and it was always under the guise of not racial prejudice, but they had a bad experience with police, and so I haven't called police witnesses, so I'd rather have a juror who didn't have a bad experience with police. And as I would say to the AUSAs, well, on that standard, your boss Eric Holder and your president Barack Obama could not sit on your jury. How have you dealt with the issue of jury selection, racial bias, and implicit bias?
My experience as an AUSA here, so I was here as a line prosecutor from 2007 to 2013, was I felt like my colleagues really kind of across the board were motivated by the right ideals and didn't always have the right tools. And so there's lots of growth that has happened during the time I was there as an AUSA, and certainly in the 8 years that I was gone. And to walk back into the Department of Justice after an 8-year gap, much has gotten better in this office. Nothing to do with what changes in my leadership. Just my predecessors, all to their credit, I think, were being much more mindful about addressing these issues, both from their own idea of what progress might look like, but also recognizing how the legal community was changing, how their lawyers were demanding different practices. But I think, I actually am fairly laudatory of what I experienced as a line AUSA back then, but not always the right tools. And, our perspective on racial justice and the legal community's perspective on racial justice issues has changed dramatically in even just a decade or so. But there are much more systemic or systematic things that the department and other prosecutors' offices have done to lean into these issues, to be mindful about how we perceive justice being administered. And I certainly say it frequently with my team, like we don't measure success by whether we win. And we measure success often by how the cases that we don't take, resolving things in a just manner, providing as much as we can to victims of crimes. There's lots of different ways to measure justice. The thing that I most enjoy about being U.S. attorney, and I hope that my line prosecutors think about it this way, is this job is hard. It's hard every day, and it's hard in good ways for me. Because when I say this is a just result, everybody in this audience is going to have a different idea of what that looks like. And we have to sort of grapple through what does justice look like. And make no mistake, we deal with people who commit horrible offenses. I am constantly engaged in how do we resolve someone who rapes a bunch of children and is likely to do it again. And where we have the tools to advocate for that they go to prison for the rest of their life. And many people would think that's justice, and other people would think you never want to send somebody to a life sentence because everybody is redeemable. And how do we grapple with these things? How do we grapple with young men of color that have propensity or history of violence? And when Judge Lasnik referred to that case about the young men that were involved in that Hobbs Act robbery, I determined that was not appropriate for federal prosecution. But make no mistake, they went to a jewelry store and tried to rob people with guns, and so needed to have some accountability. In that case, we decided to dismiss that case. They went back to the county and they entered into a deferred prosecution agreement. That was justice for them. But I don't think my predecessor approached that case with racial bias or racial malice or anything like that. He just had a different perspective of what justice looked like.
But, you know, when I sat on the Ninth Circuit last year, and Ali was down there with me, we had a Hobbs Act robbery case out of Nevada. And Judge Miranda Dew was the trial judge. And the issue was racial discrimination in jury selection. But, you know, I asked the federal defender out there, why this was just a regular walk into the drugstore with your hand in your pocket, hey, I got a gun, give me your money. Why is it charged federal? And she didn't ever think to ask and didn't have an answer. And you know, I talked to Miranda Dew, who's a good friend. She said, never occurred to me to raise that. But, you know, she was like, you were absolutely right, Judge Lasnik. We have a role to play in trying to seek fairness and justice as judges, and U.S. attorneys have a role to play in those things. And it doesn't mean that we're always going to get our way. It doesn't mean that it's always the right thing. I sentenced someone to a sentence that Nick described as not justice. And, you know, he's entitled to his opinion, and I love him still. You know, not always right. And, you know, neither is he. And reasonable minds can sometimes disagree. But you have to have in the system people who care about doing the right thing. And, you know, Nick knows that that's what I care about, and I know that that's what he cares about. And it makes the system just so much better than being in a place where the judge and the prosecutor are at odds with each other, et cetera.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, there's plenty of defense lawyers in this room who probably have disliked a lot of decisions I've made. And I talk to my counterpart in the Federal Public Defender's Office quite often, and he and I have a good relationship. He has been on me about decisions that he thinks are not in the interest of justice and that we've over-incarcerated people. And, you know, we approach those on an individual basis, trying to do the right thing in those cases. And I have an idea of justice that is different than his. But, you know, Judge Lasnik knows this, and anybody who's practiced criminal law in other jurisdictions, there are marked differences across the country. And even when I talk to my peers, most of whom are, you know, Biden appointees, working for Merrick Garland, when I hear some of the things that they're advocating for, I'm shocked. You know, regularly putting out 50-year, 60-year sentences and doing some with pride, where we would never see that, and even if we wanted to do that here, the judges here would never allow it. And, you know, and it's just surprising to me that even in this era, how we conceive of what justice looks like varies dramatically on jurisdiction and the people who are in those decision-making positions.
Absolutely.
One of my colleagues the other day got called to the carpet by a federal judge in his district in Louisiana, and the judge was livid about the new Garland charging policy memorandum, which encourages us to look more closely about the use of mandatory minimums. And the judge read in the Riot Act, why are you dropping this 20-year mandatory when, you know, down to a 10? And this is, you know, soft on crime, and, you know, and that's a lot of pressure for a prosecutor to get. And you know, so we have to be mindful and I think consistent about talking about these issues. And you know, Judge Lasnik was upset when I talked about that particular case when I said it wasn't a just sentence. But I think actually being transparent about these issues is healthy and good for our community to be engaged in a dialogue, because that's how we sort of figure out where we want to be headed in the long run.
So, Jack, we had a question that Tony got on his email sound we heard. But how did the Jaworski family respond to the fact that you took this hero and, you know, really kind of made him look like a villain? They didn't like it at first, did they?
They did not. There's a wonderful journalist by the name of Robert Draper. He's written several books about the presidency. He's a regular writer in the New York Times Magazine, and he's the grandson of Leon Jaworski. He wrote an email to Leslie and I almost immediately after publication and said, who are you? We've never heard of you. My grandfather is a hero. How dare you? And I said, well, look, you know, the back of the book has 40, 50 pages of all of our notes, references, and sources. And we were still in the hardback at that point. I said, I sure hope we'll have a paperback or e-edition. And man, if you've got errors here, point them out, because we were vetted pretty heavily on this, given Jaworski's firm, right? And this is before publication. And in the end, a couple months later, he wrote back and essentially said, oh, I guess that's why Grandpa never talked about this case. And then truthfully, two things about him. One is Leon Jaworski wrote 3 autobiographies. Who does that?
William O. Douglas.
And the one time yeah, it's true. One time he mentions this case, he got some of the facts wrong, conveniently, but he mentions it in passing, like a paragraph.
Yeah, he had the Italian POW hanged or lynched somewhere else.
In a barracks, he said, and you know, for obvious reasons. And really, you know, this is something please to think about. I want to address 2 quick things while we still have time. Number one is when somebody said, I think it was you, Nick, why don't I know this from the park? Hey, if you're a citizen of the city of Seattle, or if you're a citizen of America, why not ask them? They've known about this. We've spoken there a dozen times or more. Why doesn't our city put up an accurate representation? Ask them. Now, I know some of the reasons why not. Oh, it's what you would suspect. No matter what they say, it's like, well, we don't want people here to become uncomfortable. Well, who's uncomfortable by this? And that's because of what I'm going to ask you on the second one. During World War II, worldwide, 50 million human lives perished as a result of war. Some of those were in bombings or combat, others were because they had starvation or disease. 50 million. So how come when one otherwise forgettable Italian private is murdered in Seattle, does the Army suddenly throw everything at it? They spent months with Jaworski doing his investigation. They spent months having Cook come in here and do his investigation. They have Beeks, who was obviously a brilliant lawyer, and Jaworski, who's obviously brilliant, and then did about every damn thing they could to try to go, put it back in its box and not talk about it anymore. Why? Pretty crazy, right? If you put those 2 things together, 50 million people die. You do all of that for one person. And I think it's part of that same reason. This is freaking embarrassing. We're facing that today. Why don't we talk about our slavery past? Why don't we talk, well, you know, I don't want to hurt somebody's feelings that that's what America did. And so maybe it's time to talk about it so that when we see, as I said earlier, the treatment of people coming across borders here, we think, oh, well, we're not going to call people who are African American all one kind of thing and just put them in a box, because there are friends, our neighbors and all, but we hear people all the time, well, those Mexicans, those Latin Americans, or frankly, those Muslims. I mean, it could go on and on and on. We're doing it all the time, the same thing that these soldiers faced back then. And so maybe if when you're jogging, you see this sign and you stop and go, oh, this is where there were black barracks, and oh, this was the largest Army court-martial of all of World War II. You're probably going to be more interested and engaged in that. And not that we haven't asked, but they're like, oh. But you're the citizens of Seattle, and why not America? I mean, it was a freaking Army base.
Well, I want to thank Nick Brown, Professor Mary Fan, Jack Hamann, Leslie Hammond, Richard Jones, Cynthia Jones, Robin Lipsky from the director of the 9th Judicial Circuit Historical Society. Cynthia, are you going to wrap things up here? Great, all yours.
Well, thank you all for being here, and can we give one more round of applause to this amazing panel? And thank you to Judge Lasnik for pulling this together and moderating it so brilliantly. And our executive director, as he pointed out, Robin Lipsky, for the 9th Judicial Circuit Historical Society, flew here all the way from San Francisco to be here. So thank you, Robin, for your behind-the-scenes work. And who you can't see and made possible to get this program cast across the 9th Circuit today is Robin's assistant, And I'm not going to get her name. I always call her Aubrey, but it's Audrey Barrett. So thank you, Audrey. I know you're watching. And last but certainly never ever least is Tony Duck, who runs all the tech here at the And just the last housekeeping item, we have 3 fabulous volunteers from University of Washington Law School. You have evaluations that you picked up on the way in. Please hand those to them on your way out. And I just want to highlight who they are so that you can all say hello as you're exiting. And we have Donald Peters. He is the president of the student body at UW Law. Megan Haywood, who star community member, according to Professor Fan. And William, can you say a word about William? It's not in my notes here from you. Our 3rd volunteer.
William, I definitely wrote about you. William is fabulous, also a major leader. We have 3 amazing community leaders in multiple organizations in the law school.
And we have Professor Fan to thank for those volunteers. So without further ado, yes, thank you, Professor Fan, and thanks everyone for supporting this program today. For more information on what our Historical Society does to bring you programs like this, visit us on our website, and we are adjourned.